Okay, well, hi everyone. I really want to thank you all for joining. For those of you who don't know me, my name is EllieHammond, and today I am presenting the Children's Equity Nature Index, which I'll be referring to as CENI, which is an analysis of young children's equitable access to public green spaces in urban Pima County. So to begin, studies have shown that regular access to nature for children 0 to 4 years old is crucial. Spending time outdoors supports their cognitive development, their emotional well-being, their physical health, and it supports community connection. However, barriers that prevent equitable nature access exist. A 2018 study found that predominantly low-income community members had less access to vegetated spaces within the city of Tucson, and a spatial analysis conducted in 2021 found that parks in more densely populated areas tended to have higher capacity pressure, as they tend to be smaller than parks in less populated areas. So both of these findings show that disparities to public green spaces exist. However, there was room for further research about equitable access to nature, specifically for young children, and throughout Pima County as a whole. So this is where the CENI comes in. A local group of stakeholders called the Pima County Connecting Children to Nature Initiative reached out to the City of Tucson's Office of Equity and asked for help mapping the relationships between young children, vulnerable demographics, and green space access. So the CENI aimed to fit this need by providing mapping products that identified where young children were living or spending time in areas that have a combination of lower green space quality, lower transportation accessibility to green spaces, and high social vulnerability. So to accomplish this, the CENI was made of two main sub-indices. The Office of Equity's Tucson Equity Priority Index, which is shown here on the left, which identifies what populations are particularly vulnerable, and it locates where these populations reside in Pima County. And then on the right is the Children in Nature Subindex, which examines green space quality and transportation accessibility to green spaces for children 0 to 4 years old. So there were 5 overall steps in the workflow: preparing the study area, making the green space quality subindex, making the transportation accessibility subindex, prioritizing the variables of the index using weights, and combining all of the subindices together into the final CENI. So step 1 in making the study area was to identify and prepare all external data sets that would be used in the study. A layer containing only urban block groups in Pima County was prepared, and then the population percentage of children 0 to 4 years old was calculated for each block group, and then this layer was joined with the City of Tucson's county-wide Tucson Equity Priority Index. And then lastly, a point layer containing all of the locations of facilities where children were likely spending time was created, and this included all schools, libraries, residential parcels, and childcare facilities in Pima County. So when I say urban block groups, I'm referring to block groups that have a majority urban population, which the 2020 census defined as densely developed areas that have multiple land uses and populations of at least 2,000 housing units or 5,000 people. So this meant that the areas being compared would be more similar in population, and this reduced data distortion and would allow for more accurate conclusions to be drawn from the final index. So next came creating the green space quality subindex, which examined the quality of green spaces that each block group had access to. So I first created a polygon layer that contained all municipal, county, state, and federal parks in Pima County, and then I scored each of these green spaces in terms of size, vegetation coverage, amenity presence, and crime risk. So the size variable examined how large a green space is and the size of its service area. And to determine these scores, I used the City of Tucson's park classifications, and this came from their 2016 Parks and Recreation Master Plan. And this table shows the 6 classifications and the size of their service areas, and larger parks indicated higher green space quality, and they received higher scores. The vegetation coverage variable considered the type of vegetation in a green space as well as the total amount of vegetation coverage. So more vegetation, particularly natural vegetation coverage, indicated a higher quality green space. The amenity presence variable looked to see if parks had bathrooms, water fountains, ramadas, playgrounds, or bus stops, and the presence of most or all of these amenities indicated a higher quality green space. And lastly, the crime risk variable examined the risk of 7 overall crime types within a 1-mile radius of each green space, and this information came from the Applied Geographic Solutions 2023 Total Crime Index using ArcGIS Pro's enrichment tool, and here low crime risks indicated higher green space quality. Okay, so this slide gives a very high-level overview of the process I used to assign the green space quality scores to the block groups in the study area. So first, using the park boundary layer, I assigned park size and vegetation scores, and then I examined the presence of bathrooms, water fountains, ramadas, and playgrounds using the same park boundary layer. And then after that, I digitized each park's entrances by hand to create a point layer. And using that point layer, I calculated both the presence of Suntran bus stops within a 1/4 mile of each entrance and the crime risk within a mile of each entrance. So at this time, the entrance points contained all of the quality scores associated with their parks. And using this park entrance layer, I created a service area buffer layer, where each park had a multi-part polygon that represented its service area calculated from its entrance points. And then using this service area buffer layer, I performed a one-to-many spatial join with the child points of interest layer. So if a child location, which again are schools, libraries, childcare centers, and residential parcels, was located within the service area of a park, it was matched with the quality scores of that park. And then because I used a one-to-many spatial join, most of the child point locations fell within multiple park service areas. So those points were recorded multiple times with the scores of each park that it intersected with. And then finally, I performed a one-to-one spatial join between the child points of interest layer and the study area's block groups, which generated average quality scores for each block group using the child points of interest located inside of each block group. Whew. Okay, so after creating the green space quality subindex, I moved on to making the transportation accessibility subindex, which examined driving, walking, and biking access to green spaces using travel times. So to do this, I generated driving service areas, walking service areas, and biking service areas from those child points of interest locations to the green space entrances. And then I assigned the drivability, walkability, and bikeability scores to the urban block groups. So to calculate drivability, I used the service area network analysis tool, which uses the transportation network data to determine the areas that represented a 5-minute and a 10-minute drive from the child points of interest locations to the green space entrances. So the 5-minute drive time areas indicated the best transportation accessibility, and they received the highest score, which was 1. The areas within a 5 to 10-minute drive received a score of 0.5, and the areas located further than a 10-minute drive received the lowest transportation score, which was 0. So the same process was repeated for walking using the same travel times and the same scoring system, as well as for biking. So to assign transportation accessibility scores to the study area's block groups, I repeated a process very similar to what I did for the green space quality subindex, where I first created a one-to-many spatial join between the child points of interest layer and the drivability service area layer. And then I calculated the drivability scores to the child points of interest. And again, because I used a one-to-many spatial join, the child points that fell within multiple service areas were recorded multiple times, reflecting all of the drivability scores associated with each child point of interest. Then I assigned the transportation scores to the block groups using a one-to-one spatial join, which averaged the drivability scores of all of the child points of interest located in each block group. And I repeated this process 2 more times to assign walkability and bikeability scores to the block groups. So next in the overall workflow was to determine the index weights, which involved a group decision-making process to figure out which variables contained the most important information for understanding the relationship between young children and equitable access to green spaces. So the Pima County Connecting Children to Nature Steering Committee is made of professionals who specialize in the development of young children, the management of public parks, and facilitating relationships between the community and natural spaces. So based on their professional knowledge and the goals that they are setting out to achieve, the stakeholders were asked to provide input about which variables they felt were most important to be reflected in the final index. And the analytic hierarchy process was the method I used to transform these priorities into numeric weights. So the AHP process was carried out using a survey that compared the level of importance for each variable within a subindex in a pairwise fashion. And then once all of the individual variables within a subindex were compared, the level of importance between the subindices were compared in the same way. And then the results of the survey were plugged into an AHP matrix where they were converted into numeric weights. So the last step in the CNE's overall workflow involves combining all of the subindices together, which is accomplished by running the Calculate Composite Index tool in ArcGIS Pro 4 consecutive times. So the first run of the Calculate Composite Index tool created the Green Space Quality Index, and here crime risk received the highest weight. And this slide shows the resulting weighted green space quality subindex, which depicts that lower quality green spaces tend to be in more developed areas with higher population densities. And when examined with social vulnerability, this map found that areas with higher vulnerability tended to be served by green spaces that are smaller, have less vegetation, and have higher crime risks. So the second run of the Calculate Composite Index tool created the Transportation Accessibility subindex, and here walkability was weighted the highest. And this slide shows the weighted Transportation Accessibility subindex, which found that low transportation accessibility tends to be in areas that are less developed and have smaller population densities. And when examined with the Equity Priority Index, areas with high vulnerability actually tended to have higher transportation accessibility than areas that had less social vulnerability. So the third run of the Calculate Composite Index tool created the Children in Nature subindex, which combined the Green Space Quality subindex and the Transportation Accessibility subindex with the population percentages of children 0 to 4 years old. And here the population variable was weighted the highest. So this map shows the weighted Children in Nature subindex, which found that when compared with the Equity Priority Index, areas with more children that had a combination of low green space quality and or low transportation access had higher social vulnerability than areas that had less children and higher green space quality and higher transportation access. And finally, the last run of the Calculate Composite Index tool combined the Tucson Equity Priority Index and the Children and Nature subindex. And here the vulnerability indicators were weighted slightly higher than the children and nature variables. So this map shows the final Children's Equity Nature Index, which found that Tucson and South Tucson were the jurisdictions in the study area that had the highest proportions of young children with less equitable nature access. And these block groups with less equitable nature access tended to be more developed, highly populated, and they are most prominent in wards 1 and 5 in the city of Tucson. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I am happy to answer any questions. And again, I want to thank everyone for their support and thank you for coming.